Hey guys, how's it going? I'm David. I'm with Respiratory. I know some of you have seen us in transition at Change of Shift. Today, we're going to go talk about bubble CPAP, the applications as to what we would want to put in or where we would want to start, what kind of patient we would be initiating the therapy on, some of the troubleshooting method, and the correct way to set up and size the appropriate interface for the patient to maximize it. So I'm going to let Brian, the respiratory manager, go ahead and he's going to introduce himself and talk about some of the things to get started.
So I'm Brian Faix. I'm the manager of respiratory therapy here at ANMC. And like David said, the purpose of today is to go through and highlight bubble CPAP and its usage, the setup, application, interfaces, indications for use, go through some of the settings where we start, managing the bubble CPAP throughout the process, and eventually weaning and coming off. So the first thing I guess I'll talk about is, before I go into the setup, so some indications. So this setup right here, bubble CPAP unit, which we use in the NICU, is more of a continuation of what's going to happen in the delivery room after resuscitation. So we'll have infants that are born typically on the more premature side. So if we have infants born at 30 weeks, 32 weeks, 34 weeks, it's not uncommon for them to require CPAP support after birth. So they may not require positive pressure ventilation or something like that on the long term, but if you're noticing signs of respiratory distress, so you're looking for grunting, flaring, retracting, any signs of respiratory distress, oxygen requirement, getting an x-ray and noticing that there's areas of collapse or atelectasis, CPAP is really useful in fixing those issues. So the first thing is, those are some of the indications. Prematurity is one. Respiratory distress syndrome is something else you're going to see in the NICU in particular. That's another indication for CPAP. And really what we're trying to do, CPAP is giving a constant level of pressure, whatever we have set. Typically 7 is a good place to start. Start at 7 throughout the weaning process. You typically go down to 6, down to 5, and then discontinue CPAP at 5. So the reason for that is we come off at 5 because 5 is the physiologic level of support. Our physiologic peak, or EPAP, is typically around 5. So once you hit that level and you're around 21% not getting any supplemental oxygen, it's reasonable to discontinue to room air and give them a trial on that. If they need more support, you can always think about things like high flow or low flow setup after that. So in terms of, I guess, the setup here and the actual design of the bubble CPAP unit, a couple of key components. So this is our oxygen blender up on the top here. So turning this knob is what's changing the level of fraction of inspired oxygen, or oxygen percentage. So right now the dial is set to 21, so that's room air. That can go anywhere up to 100%. So we're adjusting that, and it's being titrated based on the needs of the patient. The flow that's coming through the unit, so this is what's actually making the chamber bubble. We'd like to start at 7 on flow. That's a good place to start. That can be adjusted to try to help with increased work of breathing or things like that, but starting at 7 is a good place to start with that. And down here on the bottom, you see the bubble chamber itself, and there's water, sterile water, that goes inside of this. It goes up to the fill line right here. Turning this on, you'll see bubbling in the chamber, and we'll demonstrate that here in a little bit. But the other key thing to note on the setup is this part here that goes down into the water is what's actually creating the pressure. So whatever number you see protruding right through the top of this chamber is what the CPAP is set to. So in the demonstration in the video right here, you can see that that's set to 7. So right now that's a CPAP of 7. Pulling that stick up out of the water, that goes to 6, down to 5, and vice versa. So we'll leave that at 7 because we said that that's a good place to start. Other elements here, this tower right here has a pop-off valve on it, but this port right here opens up, and if you have an oxygen analyzer, the oxygen analyzer will go right inside of there. So we'll keep that closed for right now. And then of course just the heater pot and heater chamber, which is the same for, you'll see this on high flow setups as well, but heater wires in there controlling the temperature, reading the temperature, and then the front face of the heater, turn that around, and you'll see your heater temperature displayed here. Two different settings that it'll be set to. It can either be on an invasive setting at 37 degrees or a non-invasive setting at 31 degrees. Typically you want to start that at 37, but if you have rain out, if you start seeing a lot of water collecting in the chamber, you can decrease it lower for short periods of time. If this starts alarming, just quickly as a side note, typically it's because the water is empty, so just check the water bag that's attached to the setup.
And I'm going to plug it in. I'm going to plug it in so that you guys can see the different levels. Invasive on top, non-invasive on bottom. The invasive will heat up to 37, non-invasive to 31. Typically we want to run in the NICU at 37. Even though this is non-invasive, the reason that we've found running at 37 is a safer temperature is because that is our normal core temperature. As we all know, 37 equals 98.6 Fahrenheit, which is where our body temp is. So we want to heat up the air and the oxygen that's coming and being delivered to the baby before it gets there. Otherwise, with these fragile NICU babies, they can, and I have seen where their core temperature can drop if it is set too low, or vice versa. If it's too high, we can lower the heater down, and that helps.
And one other thing to, I guess, highlight also the importance of the temperature, as David was saying. In addition to that, for every degree of temperature that you lower this, the baby is having to make up that difference in evaporative heat loss from their airways, which means that they're going to work harder, they're going to burn more calories. So it is important to keep this at 37 degrees if you can.
Yep. Okay, so now we've got everything there. As Brian was saying, okay, that's where your water bag is going to connect, right up there. Most everybody has seen or had a baby on bubble CPAP, but we do have some new nurses coming in, and they've all been fantastic, and we want to continue that. So about a year ago, we standardized our system, our interface, and the entire setup that we use here. We're using the Fisher-Purcell system. It's exclusively the only one we use. So with bubble CPAP, we need three different things. We need a flow, we need a form of pressure, and we need a way to deliver that in a closed circuit. The closed circuit is going to be the baby and the baby's lungs. So we have the flow coming in. Flow is going to come from our flow meter into the chamber, through our inspiratory limb, into the baby's lungs, through, and then back. It all happens in a split second, but we're using the bubble and the surface tension of that bubble when it pops, so to speak, to create that back pressure and that positive pressure. It all happens very, very quick, but it is a very, very gentle way of performing a continuous pressure. That's why we use it in the NICU world pretty much exclusively, is because these are tiny little lungs, fragile little lungs, and we want to deliver that kind of necessary therapy in the most gentle form possible. So, inspiratory, so we've got all of our stuff connected. So next step. Baby comes in from the delivery room, gets sat down, okay? The RT or nurse, the OFC is important, right? So when we're putting a baby on bubble CPAP, it is a shared responsibility of getting the OFC. And that's kind of our initial go-to. So when we're doing this for bubble CPAP, we want to try to make sure that we are midline, right above the septum, midline of the forehead there, come around. And we want to measure at the thickest part. Come over and we can see that the baby's OFC is about 31. Okay? Excuse this baby, she's not the most pliable, so if it looks like the baby's head is a little loose, it wasn't me, it was the cheap baby. So we have 31. Now next, we have these bonnets now, and we did only have headgear. These bonnets are really, really useful because, as you can see, 29 through 36. So it gives you a range. They stretch really easily and you can fit them over the baby's head. They will come out tight, so don't be afraid to stretch. there. Up there. We want to try to make sure that we're as down low as possible towards the back of the head, because that's going to give us our most secure and best fit. So that right there is about how we want to look with the bonnet on. Bonnet serves two purposes. It holds our interface and it also maintains the baby's heat. So we have our bonnet on, we're ready to go. Okay, the bonnet comes with two different sides. Okay, that's going to be our connecting side. Typically we want to start with our latch all the way over to give us the most room to play with. So there and there, and now we have total wiggle room. So next step, figuring out the trunk. This is one of the most important steps and one of the steps that gets forgotten the most, and it's, like I say, it's one of the most crucial and valuable steps. So how we're going to measure the trunk. We have three different sizes here. We have a 70, we have a 70, a 50, and 100, okay? And those are in millimeters. So based off of that, each one of these is going to serve a purpose. The 50, typically we are not going to use that often at this facility because in the 10 years I've been doing it, and you know, through Brian's career, I've only ever used a 50 on a micro preemie baby. So we have them if we do need them. So you will always have your resource, but typically the 50 is not going to be our go-to here. Mostly it's going to be the 70 and the 100. How we're going to determine that? We are going to take from the baby's nose, right above the upper lip, underneath the septum, to the top of the head. And you can see this frosted trunk part from here to here, right where this white swirly tubing ends, or begins rather. This frosted part, we want to sit from here to the top of the baby's head. Again, above the lip, top of the baby's head. If we were to put the 100, which is in my hands now, on top, we can see that the frosted part, Connie, if you want to come on over on this side, a little bit to your right, you can see that the frosted trunk goes well past the baby's head. Mm-hmm. The 50 ends well short of the baby's head, top of the head rather. Mm-hmm. So the 70, we can see, is the Goldilocks for this child, where it ends just about perfect right there. So the 70 would be our choice for this one. Next step, now that we have our trunk, we've determined what size we are going to use, we're going to determine the size of interface we're going to use. So just by looking at this child, we see a pretty small nose. So it would be logic of thinking, okay, let's grab a small, maybe a medium mask. These little tools come in every trunk container. Each one of these is in here, and we also have them in our CPAP mask prongs container. It's like a little toolbox for CPAP. So how we want to go about it is we want to take this, and you can see it has small, medium, large, and extra large. So those are the size of masks that we have. So if we put a small over the baby's nose, we can see that we can just barely get below the nares, but on the sides we're pinching the nares, and the bridge of the nose, the top of the mask, isn't even on the bridge of the nose, and that's kind of our target area. Targeting, we want enough room on the sides of the nares, below the septum, still above the upper lip, and the bridge sitting, or the top of the mask, sitting right on the bridge of the nose. So we can see that the small is too small. The medium, we're getting closer, but we still have a little bit, and I hope the lighting is picking up, but we still have a little bit of a pinch on the nares, and we're still a little bit low. So if we slide over one more to the large, we can see we are below the septum, above the upper lip. We have plenty of room on each side of the nair, and the top of the mask is sitting perfectly on the bridge of the nose. So then, come over here, we determine it's really hard to see, but you'll be able to see they're right here. There's a large and an extra large. It's got a little XL right there, and the large would be right there. It's going to be really hard to see in the camera, but on the right side of the mask you will be able to see it. So if we put the large over and onto the baby's nose, it's a perfect fit. We can see the sides of the nares. We're underneath the septum. We're encompassing both nares, and the mask is sitting right on the bridge of the nose without intruding into the eyes. So the large would be our go-to on this child. Putting the mask into the trunk just slides right on in, like so. Push up, and there it is. Sets down, and now we are good to go. Okay, your flow, again, as Brian was stating earlier, is going to be turned up to a 7. Okay, that's a good starting point. That's enough flow to allow that level of CPAP, and also it's enough flow to clear out the dead space of the circuit. That allows us to ensure that we are not having the baby rebreathe their own CO2. We do not want them rebreathing their CO2. Equals bad news for us and baby. Okay, and as you can see, with each one of these as well, there are these little tabs. A lot of times they get thrown away. Keep them, keep them, keep them. And I will show you why now. All right. So again, we have our mask chosen. We've got a good fit. We come over, and this baby is a very rigid plastic, so it's not going to act like a normal human. But you guys get the gist. So we have the mask secure. We go to tighten. Little by little, increment by increment, equally on each side, and then we let go, and we can see that the baby is still here. However, we're not all that level right there. We want to ensure that our trunk is at a nice level, because if we go down here and we crank down, we still have a little bit of pressure on the mask. To try and achieve the level of the trunk, we're having to crank down hard here and crank down a little bit too much here. Now our mask is a little bit smush, our trunk might be level, but the interface is not going to be operating properly. So what's really nice about these little pads is we can start over if need to, come up, take one of these little pads, slide them underneath this, and now the mask is no longer smushed against the baby's nose. We're not going to worry about breakdown or covering up a nair. Nice and easy comes the tab. We can see our trunk is nice and level. Our mask is lightly sitting on top of the child. And we have a sufficient bubble CPAP going. So that is the interface. Okay? So these little points make or break your day, and they also make it or break it for the baby. A baby's gonna cry, a baby's gonna act the way that we would hope a baby would act when they are in the most comfort that they can. They don't know, one of the things is, remember, they don't know that they need this until they need it in an emergency situation. So it's our job as caretakers to provide them with the easiest comfort and the best care we possibly can initially, so that they get off of it as quickly as possible. Bendies are always good to use for your circuit if need be. Okay. One thing I wanted to point out as well is once we have our interface, remember that all we need is a closed circuit to create a bubble. So right now, if you look over here, we don't have a bubble. There's no bubble going, and now there's a bubble. But my finger is what's causing the closed circuit. So even though your chamber might be bubbling, doesn't necessarily mean that you are delivering the CPAP and the necessary therapy to the baby. The only way that you can truly tell is once you've got your interface on and you're all strapped up and we've got the bubble going. Like I said, this child is not a hospital dummy. It is a cheap baby doll at Fred Meyer's. The only way to do it is auscultating the lungs. Listening to the lungs is your best way of knowing that you are delivering the therapy. The same bubble that you hear back there, you should be hearing in the lungs once your interface is strapped in, correctly positioned, and baby is receiving therapy. Listening to the lungs, all fields of the lungs, you will hear a bubble if it's being done correctly. Chin straps. For the gestational age of babies that we typically deal with, a binky is going to be your best friend when it comes to closing off the mouth and stopping that pop-off valve. The mouth acts as a pop-off valve when the baby has too much pressure in it, or they don't have the motor skills to close it. Micropreemies typically do not, so they need the chin strap. Other older gestational babies into that 32, 33, 34 realm, usually they have the motor skills and they're looking for the nipple on the mom's breast. The binky serves as that, or positioning wise, if you need to, try some different forms. You can tuck the child's hand up underneath their chin. That's a position of comfort to help close the mouth and keep the closed circuit. Okay, so once we've determined our trunk, the two different limbs, we want to try to focus on putting the blue on top for a couple of reasons. As we know, the flow is coming through the blue inspiratory limb. That way it comes through the top and comes down right away instead of having to come down from the bottom. We have a direct path with the flow being directed down towards the baby. Another reason is condensation. If we have condensation building up in here, yes, we do have a heated wire circuit, but condensation can build up, and it can, this temp probe right here, if condensation hits that, it will start alarming and it'll drive you bonkers and the baby bonkers, because your heater will constantly start alarming. Okay? One thing that does help with that, making sure that we, on our checks, are making sure there's no stagnant water in there, that everything is level and elevated, and we have the low point down below the actual patient. Okay? Touching on that note, we want to always ensure that our bubble CPAP and our heater are below the patient as well. If we have it too high up, that's just more work for the machine to do, more work for the baby, and we run the risk of lavaging and sending any kind of condensation down into the baby and lavaging them. Okay, and with positive pressure, and a driven flow, you can almost guarantee that you're going to send that condensation straight into the baby's lungs, which we do not want. All right, so positioning, we can go prone, okay? So if the baby were laying down, we can still position our CPAP. Having a little surfboard underneath definitely helps. Like I said, again, I can't stress how non-compliant this baby is. But again, we still want to target keeping our trunk level and straight, mask in good position. You can tuck the hand up underneath the chin if need be, or a binky right there. Okay, so some troubleshooting on this thing. Babies cry, and as Brian correctly was stating, we all make a physiological peep. So if you have an older gestational baby, say 30, 36, 35, 37 week baby, and they're still needing CPAP for that transition period, they still have enough strength to cry and create that auto peep. If we're on a CPAP of 7, their physiological peep is 5, and they take a big deep breath and they try to cry. Well, what they're doing at that time is they're building up their lungs and they're holding their own peep. They're increasing their interthoracic peep by upwards of 8 to 9 sometimes. So if you're on 7 and you've got a baby that's increasing their CPAP, their own personal CPAP, up to 7 or 8, you could potentially be giving that baby more CPAP than you're anticipating. We've seen it done where the older gestational babies, they take that big deep breath, they cry, and like a balloon, pop. Okay, their lungs can't handle that level of pressure. So CYA, and it's not a bad thing to do. If the baby is crying and it's an older gestational baby, and you as the healthcare worker are slightly concerned with a pneumothorax, you can take your temp probe and let it go. Okay, this will relieve the pressure that's going back there. Okay, once baby calms down. Now all they have at this point is just their own peep. Baby's calming down, they're looking a little better, they've got their binky, their sweetums, whatever it may be. Don't forget to close up again, recreate your closed loop, and you're good to go. Another way, when nurses are listening for murmurs and heart sounds, belly tones, all of that stuff, if you've got a good seal, you've heard the bubble in the chest, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to hear good heart sounds. Don't be afraid to take that out for a second and auscultate and listen for your heart sounds, your belly sounds, anything else you need to do. Just remember that needs to go firmly back into the circuit and hear the bubble again. Once you're done and this is back in, quickly auscultate the lungs, ensure that you've got a bubble going and the baby's getting the therapy. Some last key things to do as far as that troubleshooting: if your bubble is very weak, number 1, listen to the patient, see if there's something wrong with the interface, and then work your way back. Is my flow on correct? Do I have the correct CPAP? One of the biggest ones, as we've all seen, it doesn't take much, and I'll show you now. It doesn't take much to stop that bubble. As you can hear, we've got a strong bubble. If this gets caught just a little bit, there's no more bubble, or very, very weak. And it doesn't even look like the temperature probe has come out. These cords, unfortunately, are notorious for getting caught, whether we're putting one of the side rails down, moving a chair, whatever happens, they do get caught. So just ensure that if you don't have a strong bubble, look at mechanical, and then assess and make sure that the patient is getting the proper therapy. Other than that, can you think of anything else that we need to touch on?
I think the only other thing that I would highlight or reiterate too, and David talked about this, is just keep an eye and make sure you're doing frequent skin assessments. One of the things that's a tendency too, if you start to lose your bubble with this interface, we've seen a lot of people just take the straps and cinch them down and really tighten them up good. That's something that you want to avoid. In theory, when you've lost your bubble, it's probably something more about the way that the device is actually sitting on the baby, more so than it needs to be tightened up.
Yeah.
So tightening that up is going to cause breakdown. With the mask, you're going to see it around the bridge of the nose, possibly underneath the nose, possibly pulling up, and you'll start to get at the bottom of the septum some breakdown there. And then also if we're using the prongs, you'll start to see prong breakdown on the nasal septum. So I would just say make sure that the interface itself looks good. If the hat gets too stretched out, that's another thing that I've seen often. If the hat is too loose, it can also make the interface just kind of flop around and you're not going to get a good seal with that.
Yep.
So sometimes you might actually need to replace the bonnet and get a new bonnet so that it fits appropriately.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to change the bonnet. We have the resources, we have the supplies. These are typically good for about 3 days, and then they start getting to that point of getting pretty darn stretchy. Just ask your RT for a new bonnet, and we just all want to work as a team together on this. One last thing I want to touch on, masks and then prongs. So we do want to switch between masks and prongs, and the way that we're going to use our prongs and measure our prongs are the same way. Hopefully you can see, and it might be easier with a darker background, is you can see these numbers 40, 30, 45, 40, 50, 40, and they go all around. Okay, so that is how you're going to size your prongs. So with this child, we can line up and we can see that 45, 40, we have sufficient coverage of the nares. We want to shoot for about 80 to 85%. We have sufficient coverage of the nares, and also it's wide enough that it will fit over the septum. If we go down even, we can see that the prongs are going to start rubbing against the septum and start creating breakdown. And it does not take long. So 45-40 would be the prongs that I would choose for this child. The septum is not going to be rubbed upon. We have sufficient coverage, and you can find everything you need in this box. So we've got it labeled for the mass, small, medium, large, extra large, and all of the numbers, 40, 30, 45, and so forth, as you can see. So it shouldn't take long, and it's a very easy process to know right where you're going, grab them, and do it. First couple of times you do it, it might take a few minutes, but that's okay. That's okay. That's not a bad thing. It's better to do things right the first time, correctly, instead of throwing stuff on, letting the baby do all of this. De-recruiting, desatting, increased work of breathing, increased FiO2, when it just takes a few more minutes to properly set up your bubble CPAP and have a better outcome. Okay, so Connie asked me to talk about some of the roles, and when we're setting up non-invasive therapy like this, we want to try to make sure that it's a complete team effort. So nurse's role, RT's role. We want to try to make sure that we're working together and there's open and closed loop communication. Open communication being, hey, I'm going to go ahead, or did you by chance already get the OFC? Yeah, I did. It was 31. Awesome. So we're open communicating with each other, but we just closed the loop, and now we know. Now we know that somebody is taking the OFC, we know the proper size, and we know that everybody is aware of it. What size mask are we using? What interface do you want to start with? Okay, we put it on at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. When do you want to change it? Well, let's change it 6 hours from now. Okay, coordinate your cares. Typically, we want to try to come in and see a baby every 4 hours and have hands-on with the baby if they're on bubble CPAP. I know in these times it's a little bit tough to always coordinate that. I don't want to expend a gratitude from the entire RT department to the fantastic nursing staff here. I've worked in a lot of NICUs, a lot of high-level NICUs, and I would take you guys any day to take care of my baby. So I truly appreciate it, and I know that my peers do as well. So when it comes to setting up the interface, there's a lot of busy work that goes on. You're needing to get your IV, you're needing to get your labs, you're needing to get your glucose, you're needing to get, you know, your responsibilities, and the RT needs to get theirs too. So again, comes back down to communication. If you see an RT having to measure and they're trying to find equipment and there's an extra hand, maybe offering, hey, can I hold something for you? Can I grab a mask and a PEEP valve and provide the baby some CPAP while you go and do your thing? No problem. And at the same time, don't be afraid to ask the RT to help you, or to ask if you have a question. It's not the RT's place to say you don't know what you're talking about, nor is it the nurses. It's a team effort. If you have a question or a concern with the setup, go ahead and ask. I think we're all professionals. I think we all know how to do that professionally. So, as much as we are the experts on this, we need your expertise just as much. And it's okay to share information. Me personally, I like to ask. I like to offer my assistance, holding a hand. If you guys are able to get the bonnet on, sometimes it's easier for a person in a certain position. A lot of times the RT is up here and they can't see if that mask is really covering the septum, or if it's really covering getting to the top of the nose, because standing at this position, it looks like I'm probably all right on the bridge of the nose, when really we already know that the small is too small. And from Connie's position, or the nursing position, they're able to call that out and say, no, you're gonna have to upsize. Boom, there we go. And again, it all flows and the transition happens so much more smooth when we just communicate and we don't feel like one person has one role and they have to only focus on that role and the other, vice versa. So that would be my 2 cents. Thanks again. Hope you guys learned something. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or find me or Brian at the same time. So
Always happy to help.
Yep. All right.